The Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 5, The Golden State Killer, Part 2. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. In the early morning of October 1st, 1979, a terrified woman laid on the floor of her living room, her heart beating out of her chest. Her hands were bound, and her boyfriend was tied up in the bathroom. She could hear the masked robber rummaging through her kitchen. He said he was only there for money, but his calm demeanor made her suspect he was there for something much, much worse. She feverishly worked her wrists, trying to break the knot, and finally, it broke. Her eyes shot toward the kitchen. The robber stood in the kitchen eating food, and he was facing the other direction. She leapt to her feet and sprinted toward the door. She burst into the nighttime air, screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to wake her neighbors. She saw the lights flashing on in the houses surrounding her. She turned to see the masked man fleeing in the other direction. She'd done it. She had escaped from the Golden State Killer. Joseph DeAngelo likely left Northern California on his last attack, June 25th, 1979. He was likely driven away from his hunting grounds by frightened homeowners. They'd increased the security on their house and purchased firearms. That compromised the ability to control his victims, taking the pleasure out of his crimes. Over the years, the Golden State Killer's crimes became more brazen. One thing remained the same. He liked to do home invasions. He relished breaking into people's homes, their most intimate spaces. According to Dr. Scott Bond, where he did the attacks was just as important as how they were carried out. It served his emotional and psychological needs. It reflects a deep fantasy the killer has about his victims. When breaking into homes became more dangerous, he could have easily switched tactics. Attacking someone outside the home, they'd probably be more vulnerable. But his psychological fulfillment couldn't be met that way. His fantasy was in the home. Something else had heightened vigilance in the area. A married couple, the Gallegos, committed a series of abductions and murders in the area. DeAngelo would have to move locations. He zeroed in on a small coastal town named Goleta, near Santa Barbara. There was a 400-mile difference from where he was previously committing his crimes. It's unknown what DeAngelo did in the early 80s for work. It's likely he got a job as a truck driver, the perfect cover for Southern California attacks. In September, 33-year-old DeAngelo was suspected on planning his first attack in Goleta. He would select his target and then make hand-drawn maps of the neighborhood, noting creeks and back alleys. He kept the names of potential victims on the back of the maps. His attention to detail showed the extent of the need for control. He had to know everything before stepping inside a victim's home. He also took comfort in knowing that switching towns would give him sort of a blank slate. Police departments at that time rarely communicated very well. It took a very long time before Sacramento police realized the East Area Rapist had rebranded and moved south. In October of 1979, DeAngelo broke into a home on Queen Anne Lane. Like in past cases, the couple reported waking up to a masked intruder flashing a light in their faces. Through clenched teeth, he demanded to know where they kept their money. He intentionally made the victims think he was only there for cash. It's believed this would make them more cooperative, as he wasn't there to harm them. It was also likely part of the fun for DeAngelo. Dr. Deborah Coughlin authored the book Vulture, Profiling Sadistic Serial Killers. She said that sadists love to fool people. They enjoy acting like a puppet master, making people dance to their whims. DeAngelo likely took pleasure in manipulating his victims' emotions. That morning on Queen Anne Lane, he tied up his victims and rummaged through their drawers. He gathered up a mere $3 and change. He dragged the girlfriend to the living room and left the boyfriend in the bedroom. He threatened to kill them both if either one tried to escape. He went into the kitchen and focused on making himself a snack. The girlfriend managed to loosen her binds and fled the house. She alerted the neighbors and forced him to flee. It was later learned that he used back alleys and creeks. He often escaped on bicycle. After this, DeAngelo was furious. That was 2 attacks he had botched. He'd gotten cocky, and his bloodlust was unsated. He had spent the next 3 months fuming as he'd botched 2 assaults in a row, but he returned to Southern California to finish what he started. On December 29, 1979, he went back to the small town of Goleta. He had spent the night ransacking houses all through the neighborhood. As a couple came home, they spotted a man run through their living room. The man had beaten their dog. The ransacker had left footprints all around the dwelling. He had Adidas sneakers. There was also evidence that he had squatted in the vacant condo next door. The next day, he broke into the home of Dr. Robert Offerman. He was asleep with his girlfriend, Deborah Manning. He woke them by shining a flashlight in their eyes, telling them that he was there for the money. Deborah pulled the rings off her fingers and hid them under the mattress. D'Angelo demanded that Deborah tie Robert's hands behind his back with twine. She did so, but tied them loosely. The attacker pulled Deborah to the side and began to tie her hands behind her back. With his attention on Deborah, Robert saw his chance. He slipped his ties and lunged, but the attacker was too quick. He raised his gun and fired 3 times. Neighbors later reported they heard 3 gunshots, followed by a pause, and then one final shot. D'Angelo shot Offerman 3 times in the chest, then shot Deborah in the back of her head. He quickly fled the scene, but he didn't know he didn't need to. The neighbors heard the gunfire, but none of them called the police. Deborah and Robert's bodies were found the next day when their friends came over to play a game of tennis. He may not have intended to kill them, but the thrill of killing them was overwhelming. He was no longer seeking to rob and rape. Now he thirsted for murder. 3 months later, he made another trip to Southern California. He chose Ventura as his new hunting ground. He picked a home high on a hillside. It belonged to Lyman and Charlene Smith. Lyman was a promising attorney. He was on a short list to be Ventura County's Supreme Court judge. His wife Charlene was an interior decorator. After 3 incidences not going to plan, D'Angelo would be taking extreme precautions. The morning of March 13, 1980, the Smiths woke up to the sight of a masked intruder brandishing a knife. D'Angelo tied them both up with drapery cord. He used a diamond knot, which is known to people with nautical training. He wanted to make sure that they would not escape. It's unknown what exactly transpired in the early hours on High Point Drive. The MO was all very similar. He would bind the couple, then spend hours rummaging through their things. DNA later proved that he had sexually assaulted Charlene. It was later known that he would routinely stack dishes on the man's back, telling them that if he moved, he'd kill them both. When he was finished, D'Angelo took a log from the fireplace and bludgeoned them both to death. Now that he had decided to kill, he decided to do it in a lengthy and personal way. Criminologist and FBI profiler Ronald Holmes wrote that process-focused serial killers derive satisfaction from torture and prolonged suffering of their victims. They find it sexually arousing. The act of murder is normally the most satisfying and the final expression of their power and control. The killer decides when and how the victim will die. Author's note: Ronald Holmes was my professor in college. A careful, calculated killer like D'Angelo would plan everything. The saying, "as you do one thing is how you do everything," applies to serial killers. You would later learn that D'Angelo's neighbors would say his lawn was meticulous and manicured. D'Angelo would plan these break-ins. Not only would he have names and maps, but he would do trial runs and break into people's homes, unloading their guns and leaving ligatures across the house to tie people up. He always wore gloves and never left fingerprints. He made sure his escape routes were poorly lit. Some serial killers would go to great lengths in disposing of bodies. D'Angelo didn't dispose of any of them. He wanted them found. He enjoyed the terror he was causing. The Smiths' murders wouldn't be discovered until later that morning. Their 12-year-old son found them. The thrill of this murder kept D'Angelo satisfied for another 5 months. The rush was intoxicating, but he eventually felt the itch for his bloodlust. In August of 1980 in southern Orange County, around 11 p.m., he prowled outside the bedroom window of medical student and nurse Patrice Harrington. He had no trouble entering the newlyweds' home, as he let himself in through an unlocked sliding door. He played out his favorite fantasy once more. He bound the couple and sexually assaulted Patrice. When he was finished, he bludgeoned the couple to death with an unknown weapon. He changed things up by placing a bedsheet over the couple and untying their bindings. It's unclear why he did this, possibly to throw investigators off. In 1981, D'Angelo's home life was about to change. His wife Sharon gave birth to a baby girl. D'Angelo was a father for the first time. He paused his homicidal urges for a half a year. He was able to compartmentalize his life as a serial killer and life as a father. It lasted until February 5th, 1981. He stalked the home of Manuela and David Wattoon in Irvine, California, just a few miles north of his last murder. When D'Angelo broke in, he probably expected to find both people, but only Manuela was home. David was sick in the hospital. He stuck to his M.O. He bound her, sexually assaulted her, then bludgeoned her to death. He left no evidence behind. With this latest murder, the media would nickname him the Golden State Killer. On July 27, 1981, he picked another young couple. Sherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez had been staying in a home as a favor to a friend. Sherry invited her boyfriend Greg over to stay for the night. It was a bad night for both of them to be there. D'Angelo stuck to the plan. He shined the lights in their eyes and told them he was there for the money, but he quickly lost control of the situation. Greg Sanchez was 6'2", and he decided to fight. He rushed his attacker. The Golden State Killer's heart pounded. Fear racked his nerves. He pulled the trigger, and the bullet wounded Sanchez, knocking him to the floor. Then D'Angelo beat him to death. Once finished, he bludgeoned Sherry. Detective Paul Holes theorized that combative victims like Greg Sanchez made D'Angelo too nervous to carry out another assault. After all, D'Angelo was nearly 45. His targeted victims were young and could be dangerous. D'Angelo went another 5 years without committing another murder. In 1986, the Golden State Killer re-emerged in Orange County. He claimed his youngest victim. Janelle Cruz was a teenager and home alone with her boyfriend. D'Angelo was apparently no longer confident in his physical prowess as he waited for the boyfriend to leave. As soon as Janelle was alone, he broke into her bedroom. He sexually assaulted her, then bludgeoned her face beyond recognition. Authorities had to use dental records to confirm her identity. 5 years of rage had built up, and he unleashed it on one person. The same year that D'Angelo returned to murder, he also became a father for the second time. A man notorious for his hatred of women only ever had daughters. D'Angelo retreated to a quiet life in Sacramento. After a few decades, the Golden State Killer started to fade from public memory. Janelle Cruz's 1986 murder was the last attributed to the Golden State Killer. He was responsible for 13 murders, nearly 50 sexual assaults, and countless burglaries. Dr. Michael Stone, a professor of forensic psychiatry, explains that the end of D'Angelo's criminal career was probably due to his age. He writes, as men grow older, their testosterone levels drop, their capacity to perform is weakened, their prey drive is lessened. He probably just didn't have the same urges as when he was a young man. Despite his inactivity, investigators never stopped the pursuit of the killer. Most believed the only way that he would stop was if he was dead or in prison. In reality, he was hiding in plain sight. Although he lived in the suburbs, he wasn't living a quiet life. His marriage was on the rocks, and eventually reached a tipping point with the birth of their third daughter. In 1989, Sharon D'Angelo moved out and filed for divorce. She briefly had a restraining order, but in time, even the domestic issues would pass. Sharon eventually went back on her decision to divorce D'Angelo. The two remained legally married, but lived in separate houses. This arrangement came at no surprise to their neighbors. They reported that when D'Angelo visited his estranged wife, he would stay in the driveway and yell to the house. He would never set foot inside. As he aged, he gained the reputation of being a moody, foul-mouthed old man. He worked the night shift as a truck mechanic. He did that for 27 years until his retirement. His co-workers there just thought of him as an average family guy. Throughout the early 90s, D'Angelo would call and torment his past victims. He would taunt them and threaten them, saying he would be back to kill them. One of the victims' husbands would get phone calls of heavy breathing and threats on his life. He said he regularly got these phone calls for 30 years. The taunting calls told police that he was still out there. In 2001, DNA evidence showed that many of the crimes were committed by the same person. This discovery inspired Detective Paul Holes, an investigator with the DA's office, who had pursued the Golden State Killer for 24 years, to turn to genealogy to help him solve the case. Private gene sequencing companies, like 23andMe, had hundreds of thousands of records. If anyone on those sites was related to the killer, his team might finally catch the elusive murderer. Of course, it had never been done before. Other investigators voiced their apprehension. Much of the DNA evidence collected over the past 40 years had degraded. Detective Holes was not deterred. He searched for a well-preserved sample. The Ventura County Crime Lab had an untouched sample from the 1980s. It was from the case of Charlene Smith. The team of investigators decided to upload the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a website popular among amateur genealogists. They had to lie to create a fake profile. The killer's gene sequencing completed in January 2018, and the data showed an extensive lineage. The detectives reached out to Barbara Ray Venter, a woman dedicated to helping adoptees find their birth parents using DNA. With her expertise, Barbara created over 24 possible family trees based on the killer's DNA. Over the course of 3 months, the team narrowed down the list to 9 possible suspects. Acquiring the DNA of a willing family member, they were able to narrow it down to 6 suspects. Naturally, the 72-year-old Joseph DeAngelo was among them. The investigators staked out his house for 1 week and followed him around the Citrus Heights neighborhood. One afternoon, DeAngelo was on a walk and used a tissue to blow his nose. He threw it away in a public garbage can. The investigators seized on the moment. They collected the tissue that would have his DNA in it. Author's note: there's also testimony that they collected touch DNA from underneath the handle of his car door. For abandoned property, like garbage, you don't have to have a search warrant. I would often let my suspects smoke in a non-smoking building, and they would always leave behind their cigarette butts. If they didn't smoke, I'd always offer them something to drink, then collect the container they used. You can get a court order and force them to give a DNA sample, but this way's easier, much less paperwork, and it's on video camera. The DNA sample they collected from DeAngelo was a 100% match. After 40 years, the police had identified the Golden State Killer. On April 24th, 2018, a warrant was issued for Joseph James DeAngelo. They arrested him at the home that he shared with his daughter and grandchild. When they cuffed him and read him his rights, DeAngelo responded that he had a roast in the oven. 3 days later, Detective Paul Holes retired. 74-year-old DeAngelo said very little. DeAngelo was housed in the psychiatric ward of the county jail on suicide watch. At his arraignment, it was announced that he would be prosecuted for 26 counts of murder, assault, and kidnapping. Many of his previous crimes fell outside the statute of limitations. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed the trial. In a plea bargain to avoid death, DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. In August of the same year, he received multiple life sentences. Before his sentencing, some of the victims were allowed to address the court. One woman, who was bound by DeAngelo at age 7 while he raped her mother, stated that he was proof that monsters are real, and she'd met the real boogeyman. The sister of another victim simply said, "May he rot in hell." This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 5, Part 2, The Golden State Killer. Thank you for listening, and God bless.